I didn't know I was being evaluated until I felt the silence turn on me. Not the quiet of grief, the kind of silence that watches, that waits, that decides. My children were standing across the room from me, close enough to touch, far enough to exclude me, and I felt it then. Whatever was about to happen had already been agreed on. My husband had been buried 4 days earlier, and yet the house had shifted like something had finally been cleared out of the way. I'm Eloise Monroe, and I want you to stay with me through this, because what happened next didn't begin with shouting or anger. It began with calm voices and folded arms. If you're listening right now, type where you're watching from in the comments, because stories like this carry differently depending on where you're standing when the truth reaches you. The living room still smelled like leftover food and funeral flowers, a mix that turns sour fast when grief overstays its welcome. Herman's suit jacket was still hanging by the door where he left it, and I hadn't taken my coat off because removing it felt like admitting he wasn't coming back. My daughter moved first, crossing the room with purpose, not hesitation. She wasn't crying, she wasn't trembling, she looked prepared. My son leaned against the wall near the kitchen, phone in hand, shoulders loose, eyes half-focused, like this wasn't personal for him anymore. That was the first thing that chilled me. Not what they said, but how comfortable they looked saying it. "We need to be practical," my daughter said, voice even, measured, like she was discussing repairs. My son made a quiet sound of agreement without looking up. No one asked how I was holding up. No one mentioned their father's name. I stood there listening to my own heartbeat and realized I was no longer part of the emotional center of the room. I was a variable. My daughter picked up a framed photo from the side table, the one of Herman and me on our anniversary, and turned it face down like it had finished serving its purpose. The gesture was small, almost careless, but it landed heavy in my chest. I didn't say anything. I had learned long ago that speaking too soon gives people permission to dismiss you as emotional. My son finally looked up, eyes sliding past my face like he didn't want to risk seeing something that would slow him down. "We can't just sit in here," he said, casual. "We need to start handling things." Handling. The word sat wrong in my ears. This was the same house where I had stayed up all night with sick children, where I had waited for them to come home late, where I had built routines that made their lives possible. Now it felt like I was standing in a space already being reorganized around my absence. "Not tonight," I said softly, and my own voice surprised me by sounding smaller than I felt. My daughter didn't respond to my request. She responded to her plan. "The longer people drag these things out, the messier it gets," she said. Messy. The word scraped something raw inside me. My hands began to shake. Not from tears, because those had already burned through me earlier that day, but from the slow realization that I was being managed. My daughter turned toward the back hallway and slowed near the closed door at the far end, the room Herman used to retreat to at night when the house went quiet. I had only learned about that study days before he died, and even then, I treated it with respect. Now, with him gone, that door looked heavier, like it held something no one wanted to acknowledge yet. My daughter stared at it a moment too long, then looked away. "We need to confirm the funeral invoice," she said crisply. The word invoice tightened my throat. My son's phone buzzed. He glanced down, smiled briefly, then slipped it back into his pocket. "I'll handle the bank stuff tomorrow," he said too quickly, like the sentence had been waiting to escape. I watched them then, not as my children, but as a pair, and something settled cold in my chest. The house wasn't mourning. It was transitioning. And standing there beneath the same roof where I had given 35 years of my life, I understood with sudden clarity that grief didn't sound the same in everyone. And whatever sound my children were making, it didn't include me. The door didn't look different from the day before, or the year before. But with Herman gone, it felt like it had a pulse, like it was holding something back just by staying closed. I waited until the house settled into that uneasy quiet, where you can hear the refrigerator click and the floorboards sigh. My children were still there, moving around in short bursts, doors opening and shutting, whispered calls that stopped the moment I came near. I didn't go looking for trouble. I went looking for air. The rest of the house felt crowded with their new tone, with their careful, practical voices that kept sliding past my grief as if it was an inconvenience. So I walked down the back corridor and stopped in front of that room Herman always treated like a boundary line. In our marriage, there were things we shared without thinking: food, bills, routines, the weight of a sick day. And there were things he carried alone, not because he was hiding sin, but because he didn't like spreading worry. That room was one of those things. He'd slip inside at night with a cup of water, the lamp coming on in a soft rectangle under the door, and by morning it was quiet again, as if whatever he needed to hold had been placed back on its shelf. When I first realized, days before he died, that he spent so much of himself in that space, I didn't accuse him of anything. I just felt outside of him in a way I hadn't noticed before. Tonight, standing here, I didn't feel curious. I felt pulled. I turned the knob. It opened without resistance. No locks, no drama. Just a room that had been waiting for its owner to return and didn't understand he never would. The air inside was cooler than the hallway, clean and still, and the first thing that hit me was his scent. Not cologne, not anything loud, just the quiet mix of soap and paper and that faint wood smell that clings to a room where someone has been steady for years. The lamp on the desk was off, but the shade was angled the way he always left it. Books lined the wall, not decorative, used. Some leaned a little, as if he'd pulled them out and slid them back without caring how straight they looked. A file box sat under the desk, neat but worn at the corners. There was a chair across from his desk that still looked untouched, like no one had sat there long enough to leave their shape. This wasn't a room built to impress anyone. It was built to hold. That's what made it secret, not the walls, his silence. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, softly, the way I used to when he'd be working and I didn't want to disturb the concentration I respected, even when I didn't understand it. I stood there a moment, breathing in, letting the scent hit the softest part of my chest. The rest of the house had started to feel like a place people were dividing. This room still felt like Herman. I moved toward the desk and rested my fingertips on the edge, not to search, just to touch something he touched every day. The surface was clean, but not sterile. There were small signs of him everywhere. A pen with teeth marks near the cap, a faint ring where a glass had sat, a corner of paper tucked under a book to mark a page. I took a slow breath and lowered myself into his chair. The leather gave a small, familiar sigh under my weight, like it recognized the act of someone sitting down to carry something heavy. For a moment, I just sat there. No praying, no speeches, no bargaining. Just the quiet pressure of being in the one room that still held him intact. I heard footsteps in the hallway and froze, my shoulders tightening as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. The steps paused, then continued, then faded. I didn't move until the sound was gone. Even in my own grief, I felt watched in my own house. That realization sat bitter on my tongue. I looked at the books again, and one on the corner of his desk drew my eye because it wasn't pushed all the way back. It sat slightly forward, like he'd been in it recently. I reached for it without thinking, my hand moving more out of instinct than intention. And when I opened the cover, something folded and pale slipped free from between the pages, fluttered once like a small, tired wing, and landed on the floor at my feet. I stared at the paper on the floor like it had slipped out of the book with a purpose, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up. Shoulders tight, throat closing, the way you feel when you sense a truth in the room, but you don't know what kind. It wasn't an envelope. It wasn't sealed. Just a single folded sheet, creased cleanly down the middle, the kind of careful fold Herman used when he didn't want something wrinkled or seen too easily. For a moment, I didn't touch it. I sat there in his chair with my hands on the armrests, listening to the house breathe, listening for my children's footsteps, listening for anything that would tell me I still had control over my own home. Nothing came. The quiet felt watched. I leaned forward, picked the paper up, and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting stopped my breath. It wasn't typed. It wasn't a formal letter. It was Herman's hand. Steady, familiar, a little slanted, the same hand that used to leave me grocery lists on the counter when he ran out early. Only this wasn't milk and bread. It was a sentence that hit like cold water. Eloise, if you are reading this, I'm gone, and you are in my study. Please don't show this to the children yet. I blinked hard. The room seemed to tilt, not from surprise, but from the way grief keeps finding new ways to hurt you. He knew I would come in here. He wrote my name like he could see me sitting in his chair, like he could still reach through the quiet and steady my hands. I read the next line twice before it made sense. I never told you or the kids about what I inherited. That wasn't because I didn't trust you. It was because I didn't trust what money does to people who think they deserve it. My fingers went numb. The lamp on his desk was still off, but the room felt bright in my eyes, like the paper itself was glowing with something I didn't ask for. I kept reading, and the numbers arrived without drama, without boasting, just written plainly the way Herman wrote everything. Like facts didn't need decoration. $45 million. He broke it down in simple language, the way you explain something heavy to someone you love and don't want to scare. Some of it in assets, some of it in cash set aside where it wouldn't be touched until after his death. Properties, accounts, holdings. He didn't drown me in details, but he left enough to make it real enough to make my stomach turn. My first instinct wasn't excitement. It was a kind of shame, like I had walked into a room and found a gift meant for someone else. It felt wrong to be holding this while my husband was in the ground, and my children were upstairs speaking in those clipped, practical tones, like they were already sorting him into categories. I read the note again, slower, and my eyes caught on the part that tightened my chest the most. Not the money, not the size of it, but the reason. He wrote about the kids without calling them bad. He didn't insult them. He didn't tear them down. He wrote the way a father writes when he's trying to be fair and still honest. He said he had helped them enough to settle into adulthood, enough that they could stand on their own feet, and that every time they came back asking for more, it wasn't need he heard. It was expectation. He said he wanted them to work, to sweat, to build something without leaning on a name or a bank balance. He wrote that he loved them too much to give them a life that would ruin them. Then he wrote something that made my throat tighten again. They will be angry when they learn this. They will blame you even if you had no idea. That's why I'm asking you to hold this quietly until you feel steady enough to handle what comes next. I swallowed hard. I felt the weight of his words settle onto my shoulders like a coat I hadn't agreed to wear. My mind tried to run ahead, pictures flashing of my son's face, my daughter's voice, the way they had moved through the house like a unit. I pushed the thoughts back down. I couldn't carry grief and money and betrayal in the same breath. My hands shook as I read the final portion. He had written conditions, not threats, not punishments, conditions. He made it clear there was a structure in place meant to protect me first, meant to keep the house from turning into a battlefield the moment he was gone. The language wasn't cold, but it was firm, like Herman's voice when he told the kids no and meant it. When I reached the end of the note, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, the air trembling on the way out. I folded the paper back along the same crease, carefully, like I could put the truth back into shape if I treated it gently enough. I didn't feel secretive. I felt stunned. I didn't feel strategic. I felt overloaded. I tucked the note back inside the book where it had been, slid the book into place, and sat there, in the stillness, trying to steady my heartbeat. That's when voices rose in the hallway outside the study, sharp, fast, my daughter's words colliding with my son's, close enough that I could hear my name carried between them like something being weighed, I opened the study door and stepped into the hallway with Herman's silence still clinging to my skin, and the voices stopped so fast it felt rehearsed. My son was by the linen closet with his arms folded, like he'd been waiting there on purpose. My daughter stood near the bathroom doorway, posture straight, eyes too steady for someone who had just buried her father. They looked at me the way people look at someone who has walked in on the end of a conversation that mattered. I didn't ask what they were saying. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I walked past them without a word and went to the kitchen because my hands needed something small to do that wasn't falling apart. I rinsed a cup that was already clean. I stared at the faucet like water could explain anything. Behind me, I heard them move again. Soft steps, careful distance, the sound of whispers trading places with normal voices. The fourth day after Herman died came like that. Not with tears, not with shouting, but with a calmness that scared me more than anger. By then, the condolence calls had slowed. The church sisters had stopped dropping off plates. The house had stopped smelling like flowers and started smelling like quiet. I woke up that morning with the heaviness of a new truth sitting in my chest. Herman was gone, and I was still here. I thought that meant something. I thought being here mattered. My daughter waited until after lunch to make her move, like she'd been taught you don't do hard conversations in the morning because people still have softness in them. She called me into the living room with the same voice she used when she was a teenager and wanted to tell me something without making it sound like she needed permission. "Mom," she said, gentle, "come sit for a second." My son was already in there, not sitting on the couch like a child, sitting in the single chair across from it, legs spread, one arm resting on the armrest like he was in a meeting. The television was off. The curtains were half open, letting in gray daylight that made everything look tired. My daughter sat on the couch but leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped like she'd practiced this in her head. The air in the room tightened around me. I sat slowly, keeping my face calm. I remembered Herman's note tucked back in that book, hidden where only grief and habit had taken me. I didn't think of the money then. I thought of the sentence that had cut me deepest. They will blame you even if you had no idea. My daughter smiled, small and controlled. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. It was the same line she'd used earlier in the week, only now it had weight behind it. My son nodded once without speaking, as if agreement was already assumed. I waited. Silence is something I learned to use in marriage. Sometimes it keeps you from saying the wrong thing. Sometimes it forces someone else to reveal what they mean. My daughter cleared her throat softly. "We've been thinking," she began, and the word "we" sat between them like a rope. It's not healthy for you to stay here right now." The way she said healthy made it sound like concern, like a doctor's advice, like she was doing me a favor. I didn't answer right away. I let the sentence land. I let it show itself. "This is my home," I said finally, low and even. My voice didn't crack. I refused to give it that. My daughter's eyes softened. Only at the edges, only enough to make her sound kind. "I know," she said, "but it's also his home, and everything in here is heavy. It's heavy for all of us. We need space to process without feeling trapped in grief." Trapped. As if I was the thing holding them hostage. My son finally spoke, his tone casual, almost bored. "Mom, you can stay somewhere else for a little while," he said like he was suggesting a weekend trip. "A sister from church, a friend, a hotel, just somewhere." Somewhere. He didn't say, "with me." He didn't say, "we'll take care of you." He said somewhere like I was luggage. My stomach turned, but my face stayed still. "And what happens to me while you process?" I asked. My daughter looked down at her hands as if the answer was too delicate to say while looking at me. When she lifted her eyes again, they were clear. Too clear. "You don't have to be here anymore," she said. There it was, not shouted, not screamed. Delivered softly like a decision already signed. My chest tightened so hard it felt like I couldn't get air around my ribs. My son leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing like he was measuring whether I'd fight. "It's best this way," he added, and something in his voice told me he believed that. That's what scared me, how easy it was for him to believe. I opened my mouth to speak, but my daughter stood up before I could, already moving toward the hallway with purpose. "We'll help you pack a few things," she said, too fast, too efficient. And before I could stand, before I could gather my thoughts, I heard the closet door slide open, then the sharp, unmistakable sound of a suitcase being dragged out across the floor. The suitcase scraping across the floor sounded louder than it should have, like the house itself was paying attention. My daughter dragged it down the hallway with both hands, the wheels bumping over the edge of the rug, and she didn't look at my face while she did it. She kept her eyes on the suitcase like it was a task she needed to finish before she felt anything. My son stood behind her with his arms folded, watching me the way you watch a storm you're hoping will pass without touching you. The three of us were still in the living room, still surrounded by the furniture Herman chose. The frames we dusted together, the little scuffs on the baseboards from years of ordinary living. None of that stopped them. My daughter set the suitcase down and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're not doing this to hurt you," she said. "We're doing this because we love you." The word love felt wrong in her mouth, too polished, too useful. I stood up slowly, the way you stand when you don't want to seem weak, even if your knees are already shaking. "You don't pack someone you love," I said, keeping my voice low. "You ask them what they need." My daughter's expression tightened for half a second, then smoothed back out. "Mom, please," she said like I was being difficult on purpose. "This isn't a fight. Let's just make this easy." Easy. That word had been following me since the burial, floating around the house like an excuse. My son stepped closer, hands still tucked into his pockets. "We're trying to help," he said, and his tone was so calm it felt like a punishment. He wasn't angry, he wasn't loud, he was settled, like he had already placed me in a category in his mind, older, emotional, inconvenient. "You're in shock," my daughter added gently. "You can't even see how bad this is for you." She said it like she knew my insides better than I did, like my grief was proof I couldn't make decisions anymore. I wanted to say Herman's name. I wanted to remind them whose wife I had been, what I had carried, what I had held together while they grew up and left and came back only when it suited them. But I saw the way my son's jaw tightened when I opened my mouth, like he was bracing to shut me down. I swallowed my words and watched their hands instead. That's what you do when you realize logic won't work. You watch for the truth in the small movements. My daughter walked past me toward the bedroom, already moving like she had permission. "We'll just grab you a few outfits," she called back, voice bright, like this was a favor. My son followed, slower, his eyes flicking toward the hallway, as if making sure I didn't run ahead of them. I stood there a moment, alone in the living room, listening to their footsteps fade, and something inside me dropped so quietly I almost didn't feel it. Not hope. Something older than hope. The belief that motherhood automatically earns mercy. From the back of the house, I heard drawers opening and closing. My drawers. The soft rustle of fabric being moved, the quick tap of hangers knocked aside. My daughter came out first with a small stack of clothes folded too neatly, like she'd packed for a trip she was excited about. "These are comfortable," she said, setting them on the couch. "And your good coat, it's cold at night." Her eyes slid away from mine again, because looking at me too long would have forced her to feel what she was doing. My son came out carrying a plastic bag with my toiletries shoved inside. No care for how they spilled against each other, no respect for the small rituals of a woman's life. He dropped it on top of the clothes. "There," he said, "that's enough." Enough. My daughter nodded quickly, as if agreeing would keep the moment from turning. "It's temporary," she said again, like repeating it made it gentler. "Just until we settle things. Settle things." She didn't say settle me. She didn't say make sure you're okay. She said things. The house, the life, the space. My son moved past her into the kitchen and returned with a set of keys in his hand. Not mine. I recognized them anyway, Herman's spare set. My stomach tightened. He rolled them in his palm, casual. "We'll keep these for now," he said, "so no one's in and out while we're trying to handle arrangements." Handle arrangements. That was the moment I understood the cruelty wasn't in their volume. It was in the way they spoke, like they owned the next step, like my presence was a complication to be managed. My voice came out low. "So what you're saying is, you want me gone." My daughter's face softened again, that practiced softness. "Mom," she whispered, stepping closer like she might touch my arm, then stopping short. "Don't make it sound like that." She turned, grabbed the suitcase handle, and began zipping it up with fast, efficient motions. The zipper's buzz filled the room like a warning. My son lifted the suitcase and carried it toward the front of the house without strain, like it didn't hold my life inside it. My daughter followed, holding the folded clothes like they were proof of compassion. I walked behind them because my legs moved even when my heart didn't want to. They reached the entryway, and my son set the suitcase down beside the front door with a final, controlled thud, like punctuation, then stepped back and looked at me as if waiting for me to accept what they'd already decided. The suitcase sat by the front door like it had always belonged there, like my life could be reduced to one zipper and a handle. My son stood with his back half-turned toward me, close enough to block the hallway, casual enough to pretend he wasn't doing it on purpose. My daughter hovered near the console table, smoothing invisible wrinkles out of her blouse, fixing her face the way people do when they need to look calm for something ugly. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before a door shuts and you realize no one plans to reopen it for you. I looked past them at the living room, at the corner of the couch where Herman used to sit with his hand resting on his knee, at the picture frame my daughter had set face down earlier, and something in my chest pulled tight like a knot being cinched. "I'm not leaving," I said softly. Not loud enough to invite a fight, just clear enough to let the words exist. My daughter's eyes flashed, quick irritation, then softened back into that careful mask. "Mom," she said, drawing the word out like patience, "please don't do this. Not tonight. Not tonight." Like there was ever going to be a better night to be discarded. My son lifted his chin slightly, expression flat. "We already talked about this," he said. "It's done. It's done." The finality of it was what hurt. Not because I believed he had the power to make it done, because I could hear how badly he wanted it to be true. My daughter stepped closer, palms out like she was calming an animal. "You're grieving," she murmured. "You're not thinking straight." The way she said it made my grief sound like a flaw, a weakness, a reason to override me. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to stay level. "I buried my husband 4 days ago," I said. "If my mind is not straight, it's because my heart is broken. That doesn't mean I'm a child." My son exhaled through his nose, a small sound like boredom. "We're not doing this," he said, and walked to the door. He opened it without asking, letting in a cold draft that raised goosebumps on my arms. Outside, the sky was low and heavy, a wet darkness pressing down on the porch light. I could smell rain in the air, fresh, metallic, close. My daughter picked up the folded clothes and the plastic bag and moved toward the door, as if we were all just taking a quick trip. "Come on," she said gently, too gently, the way you speak when you want someone to cooperate so you don't have to feel guilty. "We'll get you settled. It's temporary." Temporary. The word hit me again, and I wanted to laugh at it because temporary is what people say when they don't want to admit they're choosing permanence. I looked at their faces, my son's blank steadiness, my daughter's tight kindness, and I saw something underneath both of them that I didn't want to name. Relief. I didn't argue again. Not because I agreed, because I realized the argument wouldn't make them see me. It would only give them a story to tell later about how emotional I was, and I didn't want my grief turned into their proof. I stepped forward. My shoes crossed the threshold. The porch boards creaked under my weight, and the air outside hit my lungs cold and damp. My son lifted the suitcase with one hand and carried it out like he couldn't wait to get it off his floor. My daughter followed behind him, careful with the clothes like her carefulness could substitute for love. The rain started as we reached the porch steps, light at first, misting my cheeks, then thicker, heavier, like the sky had been waiting for the exact moment I stepped out to make it official. My son set the suitcase down on the porch, then placed the bag beside it. He didn't look at me. He looked back inside the house, as if checking that everything he wanted was still there. My daughter stood a step away, arms wrapped around herself now, her mask cracking just enough to show discomfort. Not regret, discomfort. "We'll call you tomorrow," she said. "Once everything is calmer." My throat tightened. "Tomorrow," I repeated quietly, testing the word like a bruise. My son reached for the door handle from outside and pulled it partway closed, leaving a thin slice of warm light on the porch between us. He finally looked at me then, eyes steady, voice low. "Mom," he said, like he was being reasonable, "don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. As if this wasn't already the hardest thing I'd ever done without screaming. I nodded once, because my pride was the last thing I had that they couldn't take without my permission. My daughter's gaze darted down to the suitcase, then back up. "You have everything you need," she said, and I could tell she wanted to believe that. The rain thickened. It tapped against the porch roof in fast little clicks. It slid down my forehead into my eyes. My coat wasn't buttoned all the way, and the cold soaked through quickly. My son closed the door. Not slammed, just shut. The lock clicked. A clean, small sound that felt like a sentence. I stood on the porch for a second, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, waiting for my daughter's conscience, my son's memory, anything. Nothing moved behind the glass. No shadow approached. No hand reached for the knob. The porch light hummed over my head, buzzing faintly like it was tired too. I lifted my suitcase handle and stepped off the porch into the rain, my feet splashing in shallow puddles, my breath coming out in short, quiet bursts I didn't recognize as my own. At the curb, under a streetlight that blurred in the wet air, I raised my hand the way I used to when Herman and I came back from dinners downtown and needed a ride. A cab slowed, wipers swishing, headlights washing over my soaked coat and my suitcase like a spotlight. The driver leaned over and cracked the window. "Where to?" he asked. I glanced once over my shoulder at the house. Dark, closed, silent, then gave him an address I didn't feel in my bones yet. As the cab pulled away, the Monroe house shrank behind the rain-streaked glass, and I watched it disappear like it had never been mine at all. The motel room smelled like old detergent and something sweet trying too hard to cover what time had sunk into the carpet. The cab driver carried my suitcase up one short flight of stairs without asking questions, set it just inside the door, and left me with a key that stuck in the lock. When the door finally clicked shut behind me, the silence hit different than it had in my house. At home, silence still had Herman in it, his chair, his soap, his lamp. Here, silence was just emptiness. I stood in the middle of the room with my coat dripping onto the faded tile, water running down the ends of my sleeves, and I didn't take anything off right away. My body was still waiting for someone to open the door and call my name, like a mistake had been made, and they were coming to correct it. No one came. I set the suitcase on the bedspread and watched it sink into the mattress like it was heavier than it looked. The bed had a thin cover with a pattern that reminded me of church upholstery, something somebody chose to look decent from far away. I sat on the edge and stared at my hands. They were trembling, not from cold, from the shock of being made homeless by the same children I once stayed up with through fevers and nightmares. I didn't cry right away. My tears had been used up in pieces all week, squeezed out in private places. The bathroom sink, the shower, the back seat of the car on the way to the burial. Tonight, what I felt wasn't wet. It was dry and sharp and tight in my chest, like something had scraped me hollow. I pulled off my coat and hung it on the back of the chair by the window, the only chair in the room besides a small desk, one that looked like it belonged in a school. The desk sat under a lamp with a shade that tilted slightly to one side. I didn't turn it on yet. The overhead light was too bright, too exposing. I wanted dimness. I wanted the soft kind of dark you can breathe in without feeling watched. I opened my suitcase and laid my folded clothes on the bed without unfolding them, because doing laundry motions felt like pretending I had a plan. The plastic bag of toiletries sat on the nightstand like a joke. My daughter had packed it like she was sending me to summer camp. I reached into my purse for my phone, then stopped. Who was I going to call? The church sisters would have sympathy, but sympathy doesn't solve a locked door. Herman's people would ask questions I couldn't answer without making my children look the way they truly were. I sat back down and looked at the room again. The curtains were thin. The streetlight outside painted a pale stripe across the wall. A car passed, tires hissing through wet pavement, and the sound made my throat tighten because it reminded me of leaving, of that cab pulling away while my house disappeared behind rain. I pressed my palms against my thighs and forced myself to breathe. My mind kept trying to make sense of it by blaming me. That's what mothers do when their children disappoint them. We don't run to judgment first. We run to self-interrogation. I replayed moments like I was searching for a missing piece of evidence. The times I told Jalen no. The times I corrected Nia's tone. The times I chose discipline over comfort because Herman and I believed raising children meant preparing them, not pleasing them. Had I been too hard? Had I been too soft? Had I let Herman's quiet way become my excuse not to confront their growing impatience? My chest tightened with each thought, because every memory came with the same sick question underneath it. What kind of mother gets discarded 4 days after burying her husband? I could still hear my daughter's voice in the entryway. Don't make it sound like that. Like words were the problem and not the act itself. I could still see my son rolling those spare keys in his palm like the house was already his to guard. The worst part wasn't even the rain. It was the calm. The way they did it, like they were handling a task, like they weren't cutting my life loose. I stood up and walked to the desk because sitting still was starting to feel like drowning. That's when I saw the book I had slipped into my bag without thinking. The same book from the study, the one that had held Herman's note. I must have done it on instinct, like my hands knew to grab the only thing in that house that had spoken to me like Herman still could. The book sat on the desk now, damp at one corner from my coat, its cover darker where water had touched it. I stared at it a long moment. My stomach turned. The note inside it felt like something radioactive. Too powerful, too strange, too impossible to hold while everything else was breaking. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, I sat in the desk chair and pressed my knuckles to my lips, staring at the wall like it might answer back. I thought about the man I married. Steady, quiet, firm with the kids when they pushed, gentle with me in ways that never needed announcing. I thought about how he used to say, in that calm voice, that people show you who they are when they think love has no consequences. I had always nodded when he said it, never imagining I would be the one sitting under a motel lamp trying to understand my own children. The room felt smaller the longer I sat there. The air felt thick. My heartbeat sounded too loud. I reached out slowly, not ready but needing something solid to hold, and I placed my hand on the book's cover. My fingers paused there, trembling, as if the paper inside could bite. Then I drew the book toward me, opened it carefully, and slipped the folded note out with a slowness that felt like I was unwrapping truth, one breath at a time. The paper felt thinner than it should have for something carrying that much weight. I unfolded it at the desk like I was afraid the motel room might hear it, like the walls might take offense at the kind of truth that changes a woman's posture. The lamp cast a small circle of light over Herman's handwriting, and everything outside that circle felt distant. Cars passing, a muffled laugh from somewhere down the hallway, the faint hum of the air unit fighting the damp. Inside the circle, it was just me and him. His first lines didn't try to soothe me. They tried to steady me. "Eloise," he wrote, "don't let shock make you speak too soon. I know your heart. You will want to explain. You will want to fix. But some people don't want explanation. They want leverage." My throat tightened. I read that line twice, then sat back in the chair and stared at the wall for a second, because it felt like Herman had reached across death and put a hand on my shoulder. I went back to the paper, eyes moving slower now, letting the words enter in full. He wrote about the kids the way he spoke about them when they were small, like he loved them deeply, but he didn't confuse love with permission. He reminded me of the first time Jalen asked for money as an adult, not because he needed food, but because he didn't like feeling behind. Herman had told him no then, and Jalen had sulked for days. Nia had once asked for help with something she could have handled herself, and when Herman suggested she take on extra hours instead, she stopped calling for a while. I had softened those moments in my mind over the years, told myself it was just pride, just young adulthood, just life. Herman hadn't softened them. He'd recorded them like a man who studies patterns because he knows patterns become outcomes. I kept reading. He explained plainly why he never told them about the inheritance. He said he didn't want his money to become their excuse. He didn't want them bargaining with him like he was an account and not a father. He didn't want the house to turn into a waiting room where everyone sat around expecting a payout. My fingers tightened around the edge of the note. I thought about how my children had moved through the house after the burial, speaking like planners. I thought about the spare keys in my son's hand. Herman's words weren't abstract anymore. They were accurate. Then I reached the part that made my breath catch because it wasn't philosophy. It was a date. 2 lines under the date, Herman's handwriting pressed a little harder, as if the memory still offended him. He wrote about a visit, weeks before he died. My skin prickled. He described it simply. "Jalen and Nia came by in the evening when they knew you were out running errands. They asked me to help them. Not a little, a lot." The words "help them" sat there like an understatement meant to stay polite. I felt heat rise in my face. He said they were in debt, real debt, not the kind you can ignore. They didn't come with humility. They came with urgency and irritation, like he had made them wait too long already. He wrote that they spoke over him, that they kept saying, "You can fix this," like his role was to remove consequences. He wrote that he listened longer than he wanted to because they were his children, and he kept searching for a softer reason underneath their demand. Then he wrote the sentence that made my stomach drop. When I said no, their tone changed. Not heartbreak, not disappointment, calculation. I swallowed hard and kept reading, my eyes burning, my chest tight. Herman wrote that Jalen's face hardened first, that he said something cruel in a calm voice, something about how Herman loved lessons more than family. Herman wrote that Nia stood up, paced, then said, "So all that hard work was for what? For you to die with it?" My hand flew to my mouth. The motel room tilted for a second, not from dizziness, but from the way betrayal rearranges your bones. Herman wrote that he didn't raise his voice. He told them the truth. He had given them enough to start their lives, and the rest was theirs to build. He told them struggle was not punishment, it was training. He told them if he rescued them every time they felt pressure, they would never know what they were capable of. He wrote that they didn't hear him. They heard insult. They heard refusal. And in that moment, he wrote, he realized something he hadn't wanted to admit, that their love had started coming with conditions of its own. My throat ached. Tears finally rose, hot and sudden, but they didn't fall the way grief tears fall. These were sharper. These were the tears of a woman realizing her husband had been reading the room long before she did. Herman wrote that after they left that night, he sat in his study until morning, not because he was angry, but because he was disappointed in a way he didn't want to bring into our bedroom. He wrote that he still loved them, but he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he saw. He wrote one line that made my chest squeeze so tight I had to press my palm against it. "Eloise, they will love you until you stop being useful." I stared at that line until my vision blurred. Then I blinked hard and forced myself to keep going, because stopping felt like surrender. His handwriting softened slightly in the next paragraph, like he was trying to comfort me without lying. He told me none of this was my fault. He told me I had been a good mother. He told me not to beg them for softness, because begging teaches people they're allowed to be cruel. Then, near the bottom of the page, my eyes caught a word written on its own line, underlined once. Conditions. The word conditions sat on the page like a locked door, and my fingers hovered over it the way they had hovered over Herman's study knob that first night, half afraid of what was inside, half desperate to know. The motel lamp hummed softly above me, and for a moment I listened to my own breathing like it was the only thing in the world keeping me steady. I had spent my whole marriage believing I knew my husband. I knew his habits, his quiet patience, the way he folded towels, the way he stood at the sink after dinner, rinsing plates like it calmed him. But sitting there with his handwriting in front of me, I realized there were parts of Herman that weren't hidden from me out of deceit. They were protected from me out of love. He didn't want me carrying what he carried, and now I was carrying it anyway, because he wasn't here to do it anymore. I moved my eyes down the page. Under conditions, Herman had written in shorter lines, tighter, as if he wanted the meaning to be impossible to misread. He didn't dress it up. No anger, no sermons. Just cause and effect. He described the structure he'd put in place in plain language, the way he would explain a rule to a child without raising his voice. He said the inheritance wasn't meant to be a prize. It was meant to be a foundation. But foundations crack when the people standing on them think they're owed the whole house. The first condition was simple. I would be protected first, not because I was helpless, but because I was his wife, his home partner, the person who had stood beside him through everything. He wrote that I would have full control of our living arrangements. No one, not even our children, would be able to push me out of the home we built together and still benefit from what he left behind. My throat tightened. I read that line again, slow. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. Herman always loved boundaries. The next lines made my hands go cold. He wrote that any attempt to dispossess me, any attempt to remove me, pressure me, lock me out, or force me to leave would trigger forfeiture. That word hit me like a slap because it was so final. Forfeiture meant you don't get to argue your way back into the benefit. It meant you cross the line and the line stays crossed. Herman didn't write it like revenge. He wrote it like a seatbelt. You don't wear a seatbelt because you want to crash. You wear it because you know people don't plan for impact. My eyes dropped to the next sentence, and my stomach turned hard. He said the condition was not based on whether the children meant well. It was based on what they did. My mind flashed back to my son's calm voice. It's done. My daughter's soft mask. We're doing this because we love you. The spare keys rolling in my son's palm, the suitcase by the door, the lock clicking behind me. I felt my lungs tighten as if the motel room had lost air. I wasn't reading a hypothetical anymore. I was reading a mirror. Herman wrote one more line under that part, and I could hear his voice in it, steady and unshaking. Eloise, if they choose cruelty, let it cost them. I pressed my fingertips against my lips to stop them from trembling. Tears stung again, but I blinked them back, not because I wanted to be strong, but because strength wasn't what I needed. I needed clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't come from anger, the kind that comes from accepting what is. I forced myself to keep reading, because I had learned something in that motel room. The truth doesn't stop hurting just because you stop looking at it. Under the forfeiture line, Herman wrote about intention. He said he was not trying to punish our children. He was trying to protect me from being treated like a temporary object in my own life. He wrote that grief makes people strange, but it also makes people bold. It makes them move fast. It makes them reveal what they have rehearsed in silence. He wrote that if the children ever tried to move around me instead of with me, they were not acting out of grief. They were acting out of entitlement. I sat back in the chair and let the words settle into my bones. The motel room felt colder. The hum of the air unit sounded louder. I looked down at the page again and realized my hand had clenched so hard the paper was wrinkling. I loosened my grip and smoothed it out with my palm, like smoothing the paper could smooth what had happened. My mind started to race forward, trying to calculate what this meant, what I should do, how any of this could be real. Then I stopped myself. Herman had warned me not to speak too soon, not because silence is weakness, but because silence is control when other people are rushing. I stared at the underlined conditions and felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion begin to rise under my grief, something steadier than sadness, not revenge, not triumph, awareness. Because suddenly, the cruel calmness of my children made sense. They weren't improvising. They were moving like people who believed the next step belonged to them. And that was when it landed fully in my chest, heavy and undeniable. My children had already done the very thing Herman wrote this condition for. The first thing I wanted to do after that realization was drive straight back to my house and stand on my porch in the rain and demand my life back. I could see it in my mind, my hand on the doorbell, my voice steady, my eyes daring them to repeat what they'd done. But I didn't move. I sat in that motel chair with Herman's note spread out under the yellow lamp, and I did something I had never been good at when my heart was bruised. I waited. Herman's handwriting was still in front of me like a hand pressed to my back. Don't let shock make you speak too soon. I folded the note carefully, not because I was hiding it, but because I needed to put the truth away long enough to hear my own thoughts again. I slid it back into the book and closed the cover, then placed it on the desk like it was something sacred, something that didn't deserve to be handled by panic. I stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had 4 days ago. Not wrinkled, just drained. The kind of drain that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from being unprotected. I turned on the faucet and washed my face slowly. The water was lukewarm. The motel towel was thin and rough. Everything about the room reminded me that I was temporary here, and that my children had decided I was temporary there too. I wanted to call somebody, anybody. My sister from church, a cousin, a friend who would be outraged on my behalf. But outrage doesn't fix a locked door. Outrage makes you loud, and I could already hear my daughter's soft voice turning loudness into a label. Emotional, unstable, grieving, not thinking straight. I couldn't give them that, so I made a different choice. I climbed into the bed fully dressed, pulled the thin cover up, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Sleep came in pieces. In one piece, I saw Herman standing in the kitchen stirring a pot, humming like he always did when he didn't realize I was watching. In another, I saw my son's hand on that door handle, closing it with no hesitation. When morning finally came, it didn't feel like a fresh day. It felt like a continuation of being unwanted. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No message from my daughter saying come back. No text from my son asking if I was okay. The silence they gave me was not peace. It was punishment dressed up as space. I sat at the edge of the bed and told myself something I didn't want to believe yet. They had already rehearsed life without me. I went down to the motel lobby in my damp shoes and bought coffee that tasted burnt and thin. I drank it anyway. The cashier didn't look at me twice. Nobody cared who I was in that place. And strangely, that helped. Because when nobody cares, you stop performing. You start thinking. Back in the room, I opened the curtains and watched traffic move along the road outside. People going to work. People picking up breakfast. People living. My world had shrunk to one motel room and one note, and yet outside, the world refused to stop. I remembered something Herman used to say when the kids were teenagers and had their dramatic moods, their slam doors, their sharp words. He would say, "Let the storm pass. Watch what they do after the thunder. That's the truth." I hadn't watched my children closely enough. I had listened to their words and softened them. I had excused their impatience as stress, their distance as adulthood, their tone as temporary. Now I had no choice but to watch. So I did what Herman did when he needed clarity. I sat with silence and let it show me everything. I didn't go back to the house. Not yet. I didn't call them. Not yet. I let the hours move. I let my phone stay quiet. I imagined them waking up in my home, making coffee in my kitchen, speaking to each other in those low, coordinated voices. I imagined them telling themselves I would calm down, that I would accept it, that I would stay gone because that's what mothers do, swallow pain to keep family intact. The thought made something inside me stiffen, not anger, resolve. I pulled the book toward me and opened it again, not to reread the note, but to confirm the feeling in my chest. Herman didn't leave me a weapon. He left me a map. The map said time mattered. That patience was not weakness. That silence could be a shield if you used it right. Around midday, my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter. It was short, polite, almost professional. "Hope you got settled. We'll come by later with anything else you might need." Later. Like I was a storage unit. I stared at the screen until my thumb stopped trembling. I didn't reply. I set the phone down and sat very still, letting that text do what it came to do. Confirm the tone, confirm the distance, confirm that they were comfortable with what they'd done. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the small slip of paper from the motel check-in desk with the number printed at the bottom. Not my children's number, not a friend's. A number Herman had written for me years ago and told me to keep just in case. His attorney's office line, the one he said he used for business matters he didn't want to carry into the kitchen. My fingers hovered over the keypad. My heart beat hard, not with rage, but with the kind of fear that comes right before you step into a truth that will change the way everyone sees you. I inhaled once, slow, and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a receptionist answered with a voice so calm it made my own heartbeat sound loud in my ears. I didn't give a speech. I didn't tell her my life story. I gave my name, my husband's name, and I said, "He's gone." There was a pause that felt respectful instead of curious. Then she said, "One moment, Mrs. Monroe." That title, Mrs. Monroe, hit me in a strange place. It reminded me that in the middle of being pushed out like an inconvenience, I was still the wife, still the person Herman planned around, still the one whose name had weight in rooms my children didn't even know existed. When the attorney came on the line, his voice was familiar in a way I didn't recognize at first. Not because I knew him well, but because it carried the same tone Herman carried when he handled serious things. Quiet, firm, no wasted words. He didn't sound shocked that I called. He sounded like he had been expecting my voice one day. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, and I heard paper shifting on his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." I thanked him. My voice stayed steady, but my fingers were white around the phone. I told him I had found a note in Herman's study. I didn't read the whole thing to him. I didn't mention the dollar amount out loud. I said, "It explains everything." And that felt like the truest sentence I'd spoken in days. He didn't ask how I got into the study. He didn't ask why I hadn't known. He simply said, "Herman left clear instructions. We can handle this carefully." Carefully. That word mattered more than revenge ever could. He asked me where I was. I hesitated, then told him, "A motel." There was another pause, and it wasn't pity. It was calculation, the kind professionals do when they are deciding what must happen first to stop further harm. "Are you safe?" he asked. "For now," I answered. He told me not to go back alone. He told me not to announce anything to the children. He told me to keep the note secure. His tone didn't dramatize it. It treated my situation like what it was, a fragile moment when people do rash things because they believe time belongs to them. Then he said something that made my stomach settle into a colder place. "Has anyone attempted to remove you from your home?" The question was quiet, but it wasn't casual. It sounded like a doorway. I stared at the motel wall and felt heat rise behind my eyes. "Yes," I said. 4 days after the burial." I didn't say throne. I didn't say rain. I said it like a fact because if I said it like pain, I might crumble. He exhaled once, slow. "Understood," he said. "Don't discuss it with them. Let's do this in order." In order. After we hung up, I sat on the bed and listened to the silence again, but this time it felt different. Not softer, just less helpless. Like I had taken a step out of the fog and onto ground that didn't move under my feet. The next 48 hours passed with the kind of slow tension that makes your skin itch. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside. No police cars, no shouting, no courtroom. Just small procedural pauses in places my children didn't understand yet. The attorney called me twice. Short calls, confirming details, setting a meeting time, reminding me not to respond if the children tried to bait me. I kept my phone close and I kept my voice calm because calm was the only thing I had that still belonged entirely to me. On the second morning, my son called. Not texted, called. I watched the phone ring on the motel nightstand until it stopped. A few minutes later, my daughter's name flashed across the screen. I didn't answer that either. My hands shook, but I held them still against my thighs and let the silence do its work. If they truly cared, they would speak with softness, not urgency. If they were panicking, they would reveal it. The next message came as a text from my son. "Mom, call me. It's important. No love, no are you okay? Important." I stared at that one word until it felt like it was pulsing. Then my daughter followed with a longer message, still polite, still pretending. "Hey, just checking in. We tried to access a few things for the arrangements, and it's not going through. Might be a bank issue. Can you call us?" Bank issue. I could picture her saying it with that careful voice, eyes narrowed, trying to keep irritation from showing. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with recognition. Something had slowed down on their end. A door they expected to open had stayed shut. I didn't know exactly what had been stopped or how it looked from their side. Herman's note hadn't listed every detail to me like an inventory, but I knew the feeling. I knew what it looked like when someone reaches for control and finds resistance. My son called again that afternoon. I answered on the third ring, not because I was ready, but because I wanted to hear the shift for myself. "Mom," he said immediately, voice tight and lower than usual. "Where are you?" Not how are you, where? I let a beat pass before I answered, letting him sit in the discomfort of my silence. "I'm fine," I said simply. His breath hissed through his teeth. "We need to talk," he said. And that calm confidence from 4 days ago was gone now. In its place was something brittle. Some things aren't moving the way they should. I held the phone to my ear and stared out the motel window at cars passing through sunlight like none of this mattered. "Is that so?" I said, my voice quiet. My daughter's voice cut in from the background. She must have been on speaker. "Mom, please, this isn't the time for that tone. We're just trying to handle Dad's affairs." Affairs, like my husband was paperwork. My son swallowed. "Can we meet?" he asked, and the question sounded like a man who had just realized he wasn't holding the keys he thought he was holding. "Today," my daughter added quickly, and for the first time, since the funeral, I heard something real slip through her politeness. Worry. I looked down at Herman's book on the motel desk, the note still inside it like a sleeping truth, and I realized the estate hadn't stopped moving by accident. It had stopped moving on purpose. "Yes," I said softly into the phone. "We can meet." We met in a place that felt neutral enough to keep their voices down, One of those quiet offices where the furniture is clean but forgettable, where the air smells faintly of coffee and copier paper, and the walls are the color of patience. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I refused to be the one rushing. The attorney's receptionist nodded at me like she already understood what kind of day it was. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered steadiness. She led me into a small conference room and closed the door with a soft click that sounded like privacy being granted. I sat at the table with my hands folded in my lap, Herman's book tucked inside my purse, my spine straight enough to remind myself I was still Eloise Monroe, not a woman waiting to be approved by her own children. When Jalen and Nia walked in, they came together. Of course they did. My son's shoulders were tense, his jaw working as if he'd been grinding his teeth in the car. My daughter's face was smoother, still controlled, but her eyes kept flicking around the room like she was searching for clues she couldn't name. They both looked at me like they expected me to be smaller than I was, like the motel had shrunk me, like the rain had washed something out of me that made me dangerous. I didn't greet them with anger. I nodded once. Simple. Sit, I said softly, not as a command, as a boundary. Nia sat first, crossing one leg over the other like she was in a meeting she planned to dominate. Jalen sat beside her, hands flat on the table, fingers spread, as if touching the surface could keep him grounded. He cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, and the word sounded strained, like he hadn't practiced using it kindly in a while. We need to figure out what's going on." Nia's voice slid in quickly, polite and tight. "We tried to access funds for funeral expenses and some other things, and it's blocked. We also tried to—" She stopped herself, then continued with a softer tone that didn't fool me. "We're just trying to handle things responsibly." Handle things. The same language, the same assumption that responsibility belonged to them. I stared at their faces for a moment, longer than comfortable, letting the silence do what it always does, make people show their real urgency. Jalen exhaled. "Did you call someone?" he asked, and the question carried suspicion, not concern. Not "how are you?" Not "are you safe?" "Did you call someone?" I didn't answer immediately. I let them feel the weight of what they hadn't asked me since that night. "Yes," I said finally. "I called. Someone." Nia's eyes narrowed a fraction, then widened again like she was trying to reset her expression. "Why?" she asked, and her tone was careful, but the word "why" held accusation. I leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just present. "Because I needed clarity," I said, "and because I learned something about your father that neither of you were ever told." Jalen's head lifted sharply. Nia's mouth parted a little, then closed. Silence filled the room like a held breath. I reached into my purse and pulled out Herman's book, placing it on the table without opening it. The sight of it made Nia's eyes flicker. Recognition because she knew that book belonged on Herman's desk, because she knew it came from the part of the house she had stared at and pretended not to see. "What is that?" Jalen asked, voice low. I kept my tone calm. "Your father left me a note," I said, "in his study." Nia's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. "He had a note?" she asked, as if the idea itself offended her. "Yes," I said, "and it wasn't just a goodbye." Jalen leaned forward. "Mom, just tell us," he said, impatience slipping through. I met his eyes and didn't flinch. "Your father had an inheritance," I said quietly, "a significant one. He never told me, and he never told you." The room changed, not with shouting, with something sharper. Attention. Jalen's eyes widened. Nia's face went still in a way that told me her mind had started doing math. "How much?" Jalen asked immediately, and he didn't even try to hide the hunger in his voice. That one word confirmed more than any confession could. Nia shot him a look, quick and warning, then turned to me with softened eyes. "Mom," she said gently, like she was stepping into her reasonable voice again, "if that's true, then we need to know what we're dealing with. We're a family. We should be handling this together." Together. The word made my chest tighten, because together hadn't existed on my porch in the rain. I let a beat pass. "I'm telling you now," I said, calmly, because I didn't come here to punish you. I came here to make sure the truth is spoken without screaming. Jalen's voice dropped. "So what does this mean?" he asked, and I heard fear under it now, fear that the power he assumed was slipping. I looked from my son to my daughter, and I let my voice soften, not for them, but for the memory of the family I once believed we were. "Before any of this happened," I said, "before you decided I didn't belong in my own home, I would have shared everything equally. I would have split it the way a mother splits what she has, so no child feels less loved." Nia blinked, and for a second her mask cracked. Jalen's shoulders loosened like relief tried to rush in. I watched that relief arrive too quickly, too easily, and it settled something inside me. I drew a slow breath. "I wanted peace," I continued, "not control." Then I reached into my purse again, pulled out a single folded page and set it on the table between us, flat, careful, like placing down something that could cut if handled wrong. "But your father wrote conditions," I said, my voice still quiet, "and one of them is about me." The paper sat between us like a small, quiet judge. Neither of them touched it at first. They stared at it the way people stare at a medical form when they already know the results won't be kind. Jalen's eyes flicked from the page to my face, then away again, like he was trying to decide whether I was bluffing. Nia's hands were folded neatly on the table, but her fingers kept pressing into each other under the calm, a nervous little kneading motion she didn't seem aware of. I didn't rush them. Herman had taught me something without saying it. When people are used to control, the worst thing you can do to them is make them sit in uncertainty. Finally, Nia reached forward and picked up the paper. She held it delicately, like it might stain her, and scanned the first line. Her eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed. The skin around her mouth tightened as she read. Jalen leaned in, impatient, and when Nia didn't start summarizing for him fast enough, he snatched the page from her hand. "Let me see," he snapped, and the sound of that snap, sharp, selfish, filled the room for half a second before he realized he'd done it. Nia's eyes flashed. "Jalen," she hissed softly, trying to keep her voice polite because the receptionist outside that door could probably still hear tone even if she couldn't hear words. Jalen ignored her. His eyes raced down the page. I watched his face change in small steps. First confusion, then irritation, then the kind of stillness that comes when a person realizes a door has closed behind them. His jaw worked. His nostrils flared once. He read it again, slower, like he was searching for a loophole hidden in the commas. Nia leaned toward him, whispering under her breath, "What does it say?" Jalen didn't answer immediately. That silence from him was the first crack. I held my posture steady, shoulders relaxed, hands resting on the table. My heart was beating hard, but I refused to let it climb into my throat where they could see it. The paper wasn't long. Herman didn't write novels. He wrote boundaries. Jalen's eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time since the burial, I saw something close to fear. This is real?" he asked. The question came out low and rough, like his throat had tightened around it. "It's your father's handwriting," I said simply. Nia reached for the paper again, careful this time, and Jalen didn't fight her. That was another crack. She read it for herself, lips moving slightly as she followed the lines, and when she reached the part about attempting to dispossess the surviving spouse, she sucked in a breath, like she'd been pinched. Her eyes shot up to mine, then down again. "Mom," she whispered, and the words sounded different now, smaller, almost childlike. I didn't soften, not because I wanted revenge, because softening too soon would have made them think softness was still something they could trigger on command. Jalen leaned back in his chair, hands dropping to his thighs as if he suddenly didn't know where to put them. "We didn't dispossess you," he said quickly, and the speed of that sentence told on him. "We just—" He stopped, searching for a word that didn't sound ugly. Nia cut in, voice smoother, polished again. "We were trying to protect you," she said, and I almost laughed at how fast she returned to that script. "You were in shock. We thought you needed rest. You thought I needed to leave," I corrected quietly. The room went still. Jalen's eyes narrowed. "Mom, you're twisting it," he said, and there it was. Blame. The same kind of blame Herman predicted. I let a small pause stretch between us before I spoke again. "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "You told me I didn't have to be there anymore. You packed my things without asking me what I wanted. You kept your father's spare keys. You closed the door while I stood outside." Nia's face tightened as each fact landed. Jalen's gaze dropped to the table. The attorney's chair at the far end of the room remained empty, intentionally. This wasn't a performance. This was family truth with no audience to hide behind. Nia's voice grew softer, and the softness carried desperation now. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we handled it wrong. We admit that." Jalen snapped his head toward her. "Speak for yourself," he muttered, but his voice lacked power. Nia ignored him and looked at me, eyes shiny but not tearful, because she was still trying to keep dignity. "Mom, what do you want us to do?" she asked. I studied her face. I studied my son's clenched jaw, the way he kept swallowing, the way his foot tapped once under the table like a trapped animal. I remembered the rain on my eyelashes. I remembered the motel room smell. I remembered my phone ringing with no comfort behind it. My voice stayed even. "You already did what you did," I said. Jalen leaned forward suddenly, palms on the table again. "There has to be a way," he said. And now the urgency wasn't about grief. It was about loss. "We can fix it. Can we undo it?" Nia whispered, and the way she said it sounded like she already knew the answer. I held their gaze one at a time, letting them feel the weight of my calm. "Is there anything we can do?" Jalen asked, softer now, the bravado stripped out of his voice. I didn't raise my chin. I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat. I just breathed once, slow, and shook my head a single time. The moment my head finished that small shake, the room changed. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of shift you feel when a person realizes a door has closed and no amount of pleading will turn the handle. Jalen stared at me like I had slapped him, and Nia's eyes filled, not with tears spilling, but with the tight shine of someone trying to keep herself together while something inside her buckles. For a second, neither of them spoke. Their silence was different from mine. Mine was control. Theirs was disbelief. Jalen was the first to break it. "So that's it," he said, voice rising just enough to vibrate with anger. "You're really gonna do this?" The word "do this" hit me wrong because it made it sound like I had planned this, like I had set out to punish them for sport. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean back. I stayed exactly where I was, steady, letting him exhaust himself against my calm. "I'm not doing anything," I said quietly. "You did it." Jalen's mouth opened, then closed. He looked to Nia like she might rescue him with softness. Nia swallowed and tried to find her footing again, tried to climb back into the role of reasonable daughter. "Mom," she began, voice controlled, "we made a mistake. We admit that. We shouldn't have—" She stopped because there was no clean way to say, "put you out in the rain," without sounding like the kind of person who does that. "We were grieving," she finished weakly, and the word grieving sounded like a cover now. I watched her carefully. Nia wasn't a cartoon villain. She was the kind of woman who could convince herself she was being kind as long as she didn't raise her voice. That made her more dangerous than someone openly cruel. "Your father was grieving too," I said, and that sentence landed like a weight. Jalen's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" he snapped. I took a slow breath. "Weeks before he died," I said softly, "you both came to him when you were in trouble." Nia stiffened. Jalen's face changed so fast it startled me. Shock first, then anger, then something like shame trying to hide. "He told you that," Nia whispered. The question sounded offended, like the betrayal wasn't what she had done to me, but what Herman had chosen to share with his wife. "He wrote it," I corrected, "because he knew what you were capable of when you didn't get what you wanted." Jalen's fist tightened on the table. "We didn't do anything," he said, but the protest sounded thin, because we all knew what he meant. I didn't argue about their intentions. I didn't call them monsters. I didn't say words I couldn't take back. I simply held the truth where it belonged, between us. "Your father loved you," I said, and my voice softened on love because love was still real, even now. "He loved you enough to say no when you wanted him to rescue you from consequences. He loved you enough to believe you could stand on your own. He loved you enough to prepare you for life, instead of buying you out of discomfort." Nia's lips trembled slightly. Jalen shook his head once, quick, like he was rejecting the whole framing. "That's not love," he muttered. "That's control." The irony almost made me laugh, but my throat was too tight for it. "No," I said calmly. "Control is what you tried to take from me." Nia leaned forward, voice urgent now, the polish cracking. "Mom, please," she said. "We can make it right. We can bring you back. We can apologize. We can—" "You can't rewind a locked door," I said, and the quietness of my words made them sharper. Nia flinched. Jalen looked away. I watched them both and felt something settle into place inside me. Not joy, not victory, but alignment. Like a bone sliding back into where it belonged after being out of place too long. "This isn't punishment," I continued. "I'm not sitting here smiling. I'm not enjoying this. I buried my husband and lost my children in the same week." My voice dipped slightly on that last part, and for a moment I felt my eyes burn. I blinked it back. Emotion could exist, but it couldn't drive. "This is truth catching up," I said. "Your father put that condition in place because he understood something you refuse to understand right now. If you learn that cruelty has no cost, you will keep using it." Jalen scoffed under his breath, but it sounded tired. Nia's shoulders sagged, and when she spoke again, her voice was small. "So what happens now?" she asked. I held her gaze. "Now," I said, "you live the lesson he tried to teach you while he was alive." Jalen's face hardened. "So we just get nothing," he said, bitterness spilling through. "After all this?" I didn't correct his all this. I let him hear himself. "You get what you chose," I answered. "You chose speed. You chose entitlement. You chose to treat your mother like an obstacle." Nia's eyes dropped to the paper on the table like it could dissolve if she stared hard enough. Jalen pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor, an ugly sound in a quiet room. He stood. Nia stood more slowly, her movements controlled like she didn't want to look shaken, even though she was. They didn't look at me the way children look at a mother when they're leaving her with love. They looked at me the way people look at a verdict they don't agree with but can't escape. Jalen grabbed the paper, crumpled it halfway, then forced himself to flatten it again, as if remembering it wasn't his to destroy. Nia reached for her purse with hands that trembled just enough to show she was losing control of her own mask. They walked toward the door. No apology, no goodbye. And as the handle turned and the door opened, I realized the deepest part of Herman's lesson wasn't the money at all. It was watching who walked away when love stopped being useful. Months later, the house sounded like mine again. Not because the floors stopped creaking or the pipes stopped humming in the morning, but because the air stopped feeling watched. The first weeks after everything happened, every room carried an echo. My children's polite cruelty, the zipper of my suitcase, the click of the lock that night in the rain. Even after I returned, even after the attorney handled what needed handling and the house was legally, quietly confirmed as mine, I still moved through it like someone careful not to disturb a wound. but time does what it always does when you let it work. It turns sharp pain into something you can hold without bleeding. I didn't wake up one morning healed. I woke up one morning steady. The calls from my children stopped after that meeting. There were no dramatic apologies, no late-night confessions, no flowers, just absence. At first, that absence felt like a second loss. Then it started to feel like clarity. I learned to eat my breakfast without checking my phone. I learned to sit on my porch in the evening and listen to the neighborhood settle, to the distant bark of a dog, to the soft rhythm of other people's lives continuing. I learned that being abandoned doesn't always arrive with a slammed door. Sometimes it arrives with silence that lasts long enough to become a decision. The inheritance didn't change my days the way people imagine money does. It didn't turn me into someone new. It simply removed the fear that had been hovering around my life like a shadow I pretended I couldn't see. The fear of what would happen to me if the people I raised decided they no longer wanted me. Herman's money wasn't a lottery win. It was protection he built quietly while I was busy believing love would be enough. The attorney had done his work in steps. No grand reveals, no spectacle. Papers were filed. Accounts were secured. The boundaries Herman wrote were treated like what they were, instructions, not emotions. I didn't sit in offices arguing. I signed what I needed to sign. I asked questions when I needed clarity. I learned more about my own life in those months than I had learned in years, not because I was ignorant, but because I had trusted the wrong people to honor what was obvious. I didn't take the house and turn it into a museum of grief. I didn't paint the walls to start fresh. I kept the pictures where they were. I kept Herman's chair in the living room. I kept the little scuff marks on the baseboards. I let the house stay honest. One late afternoon, the sun angled low through the windows and made the dust glow softly in the air, and I realized I hadn't gone into the study in weeks, not because I was afraid anymore, but because I no longer felt pulled by panic. The study had stopped being a wound and become what it always was, a room where Herman went to carry what he didn't want to lay on my shoulders. I walked down the corridor and stopped at the door. My hand rested on the knob for a moment, and I noticed something small but important. I wasn't bracing. I wasn't trembling. I opened it and stepped inside. The room smelled the same, but not in a way that made my chest collapse. It smelled like paper and wood and a faint trace of him, like an old hymn you can hum without crying. The books were still there. The lamp was still angled. The chair waited behind the desk like it always had. I crossed the room and ran my fingers lightly across the desk surface, feeling the smoothness, the quiet order. I sat in his chair again, but this time I didn't feel like an intruder. I felt like a woman returning to a place that finally belonged to her too. I opened the drawer where I had placed the note after everything, after I had read it 100 times, after its words had burned themselves into my memory, after it had guided me through the worst week of my life, without ever raising its voice. The paper was inside a simple folder now, protected not by secrecy, but by intention. I lifted it and unfolded it once more, not to relive pain, but to witness the calmness of Herman's mind. The lines didn't hit like cold water anymore. They hit like truth you already survived. I read the part about the children and felt a dull ache. Not rage, not satisfaction, just the sad understanding that people can love you and still fail you when desire is louder than character. I read the condition again and felt my spine straighten, not with pride, but with gratitude. Herman had not left me a battle. He had left me an exit from being treated like a sacrifice. I folded the note carefully and held it in my hands for a moment longer, letting myself feel the full weight of what endurance actually means. Endurance isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply stays standing when everything around it tries to collapse. I slid the note back into the folder and placed it in the drawer. Then I did something I had never done before, not once in 35 years. I locked the study drawer and put the key in my pocket. Not because I was afraid someone would steal it now, because that room and that truth was no longer something I tiptoed around. It was mine to hold, mine to manage, mine to protect. I stood, turned off the lamp even though it hadn't been on, and looked around the study one last time with a calm I never thought I'd earn. Power didn't come from money. It came from the moment I stopped begging to be treated like family and started living like I already belonged.